Today, we're going to work to try to continue to understand the enigma that is Lyndon Baines Johnson. And so, well, we already covered Johnson's role in the civil rights movement, in which he gets, legitimate praise and laudits for pushing forward the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. The long-term legacy of the Great Society and the Vietnam War are much more complicated and complex. So let's try to unpack LBJ, who's just an interesting, larger-than-life guy. And because I'm trying to keep these lectures as short as possible, I'm not going to go into all the LBJ stories. What we'll say is he's huge. One, he's like 6'3", 250 pounds. He's a massive, larger than life Texan. He used all of his size and stature to become one of the most effective legislators in American history. As a member of the House of Representatives, he was an expert at getting people to vote the way he wanted. And he had this thing called the Johnson treatment, where he, as you can see in these pictures, used a combination of invasions of physical space, bribery, and threats to get people to fall in line with his agenda. So that's good to know because Johnson's going to use all of this to basically get Congress to do whatever he wants them to do. And so, much the same way that FDR was able to basically drag Congress along and set the agenda and ensure that all of his stuff got passed, Lyndon Johnson does basically the same stuff. Other things you should know about LBJ, I guess the only other thing I'll say, and I'm not going to post a document about this, but he was also incredibly competitive to the point where Kennedy was well known for having affairs, but Johnson did his best to outdo Kennedy on the affairs that he had, and that's all I'm going to say about it. Johnson's massive legislative platform was called the Great Society. All of these politicians going all the way back to Teddy have had these signature platforms with, catchy slogans. And so Johnson's was the Great Society, and it had a bunch of different pieces in it that we're going to get into. So part of this is immigration reform. The Immigration Act of 1965 finally undid the restrictive quotas of 21 and 24. And so, as you can see here, there's just a slight change in the point of origin from where immigrants are coming from after this. And it did this because, of course, it removed the quota system and replaced it with a variety of other sort of metrics to determine who would be allowed into the country. So it was no longer just what country you came from. One of this is family connections. One of the criteria that we look at is family connections, and the other one is we try to allow people in from places that we don't have that many immigrants coming from, and we also have some merit-based pieces as far as recruiting people who work in highly skilled fields. So the Immigration Act completely reformed the immigration system and changed the sources of American immigration. Johnson also launched what he called the War on Poverty. He gave, I think, the documents. I think when we get into the documents, he gave some number of pretty expansive speeches on this. And the War on Poverty was just that, an attempt to stomp out poverty. Johnson grew up poor in Texas. He went to West Texas State Teachers College or something like that. And he always felt like the Kennedys and the sort of blue bloods of American society were looking down on Lyndon Johnson. And so he made it his goal to try to eradicate poverty, which is a laudable goal, but of course massively challenging. One of the things that he passed was the subsistence nutritional SNAP. I forget what the acronym stands for right now. It's what became food stamps. So he's going to pass that as part of the Farm Bill, and he's going to roll out this massive series of programs. And so I'm going to pause the video here and take a moment to take note of these, and then we'll come back once you've done that and talk briefly through them. Okay, hopefully you're back at this point. You can see health and welfare, Medicare and Medicaid are two big pieces. Child Nutrition Act, which would eventually become SNAP. Head Start was a huge part of this. The Elementary and Secondary Education Act created nationalized standards for education. And then, of course, you've got some urban development stuff, and you've got some consumer and environmental protection. So, the Great Society, at some point, we'll do an activity comparing the Great Society to the New Deal. But for right now, I'm just going to move through all of these programs because I want to keep this as short as possible. So, if you haven't paused yet to take these down, pause, take these down. You need to know these. But I'm not going to talk through each one of them in depth. The effect of the Great Society was pretty stark as far as it significantly decreased the poverty rate. And so, in some ways, the war on poverty was massively successful by providing all of these opportunities. We significantly decreased the number of people living in poverty. The problem with the Great Society is its massive entitlement programs, and therefore it required massive amounts of money in order to make it work. And critics of the Great Society point to its failures and argue that since it didn't completely eradicate poverty, these gains were somewhat wasteful uses of government money. The Vietnam War is the other side of Lyndon Johnson. So we've got civil rights, where Johnson scores pretty well. The Great Society, where it sort of depends on your political leanings. And then Vietnam is, of course, Johnson's basic disaster and the thing that would end up bringing down his presidency. As you may remember, the mess that became the Vietnam War came out of a combination of French colonialism and the end of World War II. The colony of French Indochina, after the French lost the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, fell apart and recreated the countries of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. Northern Vietnam had already been a part of a Japanese puppet state, and so it was then taken over by communist-leaning rebels. And the quote unquote legitimate government of Vietnam was stationed in the south, which was a nationalist government that was friendly to the United States. So, if this sounds familiar, hopefully this sounds familiar. Ah, what a mess. They were supposed to, of course, hold elections in 56, but there were massive claims of voter fraud, and the guy who won the election, a guy named No Din Diem, was unbelievably unpopular. And so, as Johnson becomes increasingly involved in this whole Vietnam crisis, his spending on the Great Society and his focus on civil rights are going to be subverted to a great degree. No Din Diem was the dictator of South Vietnam. And obviously, he was friendly to the United States because he wasn't a communist, but he was an autocratic leader, was Catholic, and oppressed the majority Buddhist population. And so we were providing military aid and advisors for him because he was facing a domestic insurgency. Communist insurgents from North Vietnam were infiltrating South Vietnam and trying to overthrow Diem and unite the country under a single communist leader, Ho Chi Minh. And so GM survived mostly due to United States backing, and but the Vietnamese people began to turn on him in the 1960s. There was a series of incredibly violent and dramatic protests in '63, including this terrifying moment when a Buddhist monk self-immolates in order to protest Diem's rule. And so in '63, we overthrow Diem and replace him with a military dictator was a prominent general. You don't need to know his name. And he's going to rule South Vietnam for the remainder of the war, and Diem is going to be horribly executed. So, the Vietnam War for the United States starts with the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And I'm going to overly simplify this because the Vietnam War is a massively complex conflict that lasted 2 decades, and you don't need to know it in that much detail for the AP test or for the Washburn test. So, we're going to just focus on the main bullet points here. The Gulf of Tonkin was an incident in which a Vietnamese ship fired on an American ship, or an American ship fired on a Vietnamese ship. There were multiple sort of conflicting sources about the Gulf of Tonkin incident. What's important is the USS Maddox and a Vietnamese ship exchanged fire, and this was used by Johnson as an excuse to pass something called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, basically said, and the document, you can read it in the documents, but it basically said the president has the authority to do whatever he wants in Vietnam for as long as he wants until Vietnam is reasonably secure. So it gave us a blank check to get involved in Vietnam and begin deploying massive numbers of American troops to try to stabilize the southern government a la Korea. So we start deploying massive amounts of American troops to try to destabilize the southern government. The problem is, whereas in the Korean War, we were fighting a specific army, right? In the Korean War, we were fighting against the North Korean army and the Chinese army. In Vietnam, we're fighting against mostly insurgents. So fighting insurgents is incredibly difficult, as we learned in Cuba and the Philippines, and a variety of other places in history. And so the government just gradually continues to get more involved because what does it mean to pacify a country when it's facing a domestic insurgency? And how do you judge when it's pacified? And so we really struggle both to specifically explain what we're doing there or what the goal is and why it's we're not able to succeed with the current amount of resources, and so we just continue pouring more troops and money into Vietnam until it's stabilized, question mark. The way that we do this is we go on search and destroy missions. We basically go out. South Vietnam is incredibly jungly, and obviously it's really difficult to fight guerrilla wars in the jungle, as we learned when we were fighting the Chinese, or no, sorry, the Japanese in the Pacific War, and the Chinese learned every time they tried to invade Vietnam when it just went incredibly poorly. So we send battalions of troops out into the jungle and try to find communist guerrillas, and then when we do, we kill them. Obviously, these missions are incredibly unpleasant. The terrain is difficult. We often used airstrikes to support this, which are not an overly precise, method of targeting people. And the goal is just really unclear, right? I mean, how we're not trying to hold territory. We're not trying to fight an army. We're trying to get rid of enemy combatants that are sneaking into a country. So, how do you know if you're winning? Um, I guess you're killing a lot of combat, not killing a lot of. Honestly, it's not really clear. Plus, Vietnam again, incredibly unpleasant. Jungly and difficult to get around in, which makes it even harder. And the fact that the South Vietnamese government was incredibly unpopular in South Vietnam means that the guerrillas have a ton of support. And as Chairman Mao once said, the guerrillas are the fish, and the people are the ocean. So what do? Well, you start draining the ocean. You start putting the people in concentration camps, or as we call them, strategic hamlets, and then just going and killing anyone in the jungle who isn't in one of these places. Sort of the same way we did in the Philippines. The problem is some of the same problems we saw in other places are that the media is there. The news is there. The TV crews are there. Images of this fight are being broadcast into Americans' homes every day. And the tactics that we were using to win the war or to fight the war were incredibly brutal. And so, I mean, we were trying to save lives and secure the country, but in the end, we ended up killing a lot of people. And for every guerrilla that we kill, it seemed like two more would show up. So, how do you figure out? I mean, we killed a lot of Vietnamese people, and then we were killing fewer Vietnamese insurgents. So I guess we're winning? Question mark. We also did a strategic bombing campaign of North Vietnam. This was started under Johnson and continued under Nixon, called Rolling Thunder, where we drop a ridiculous amount of bombs on all targets of interest in North Vietnam to try to persuade them to surrender. So we've got massive bombing campaigns, and then of course we also start breaking out chemical weapons in order to destroy the jungle to reveal the guerrillas. And so we dump Agent Orange, which is a chemical defoliant, napalm, which is sort of a gelatinous uh, substance that then combusts and set the jungles on fire. And this ends up killing a bunch of people, not always the people we were intending to kill. So problematic. But you could sort of argue that all of this was reasonable. We're trying to, we don't want the South Koreans are glad that they're not North Korea. South Vietnam, we need to save the South Vietnamese from the communists. And so for a while, it seemed like the government strategy was winning until the Tet Offensive really changed our perspective on this. The Tet Offensive was a massive North Vietnamese offensive in which they attacked all of these targets in 1968. It was a massive defeat for the North Vietnamese army because we were able to, the South Vietnamese and American forces were able to repulse the attack. But what this showed us is despite 4 years of fighting, we weren't any closer to winning the war. And maybe the war wasn't winnable. So the war started becoming increasingly unpopular. We saw the devastation that it created. And we started expanding the war into Laos and Cambodia because we got this idea that the North Vietnamese were sneaking down through the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So if we can only cut off their supplies, maybe we could stop this thing. Plus, there's a sunk cost fallacy here. How many American kids have gone and died in Vietnam, and now if you withdraw, did they die for nothing? And so the Johnson administration was stuck because they didn't. There wasn't a clear strategy going forward that they were willing to embrace that seemed like it might bring victory. So we started bombing Laos and Cambodia, which then further destabilized both of those countries, which is quite unfortunate. And a much larger anti-war movement starts showing up in the United States, especially amongst young people who don't want to necessarily go fight in Vietnam. It's important to note that, of course, this was not a majority of Americans opposed to the war, but a growing vocal minority were starting to speak out much more strongly against the war and against American foreign policy in general. So we'll talk more about this tomorrow when we get into the second day of the Vietnam War. And look, catchy slogans. Ooh, and profanity. My sincerest apology. Cover your eyes. We'll get to the student protests on campus. We'll get to that tomorrow as well. But I should note, the government strongly did censor and criticism, and so there's one of the documents is about the Smothers Brothers and the censoring of their show. But as TV personalities became more critical of the war, government censorship stepped up. And I'll post this song. Protest music was very important to this too, and so I'll post some of this stuff for you guys to appreciate. So that brings us to 1968 and the Democratic National Convention. Oh man, this was a hot mess. So in 68, LBJ is not going to run for re-election. Man, the hey hey LBJ, how many kids you killed today? He did not appreciate that chant at all. So Johnson competes in the Vermont or the New Hampshire primary, and although he wins, it's by a terribly narrow margin. And so LBJ just throws up his hands and announces he's not running for president. So who's going to be the Democratic nominee if President Johnson's gone? Well, there were a couple different people competing for this. Eugene McCarthy was appealed to the youth vote, and Robert Kennedy became. So McCarthy is somewhat of an extremist candidate on the left, and Robert Kennedy, the younger brother of John F. Kennedy, starts coming out as the sort of larger as the front runner in the Democratic nominate for the Democratic nomination. And then Robert Kennedy is assassinated. So another Kennedy goes down, and now all of a sudden it's just Eugene McCarthy, an anti war, anti establishment Democrat who's running for the nomination. So what ends up happening is the Democrats decide to just throw out the results of all the primaries and nominate Hubert Humphrey as president, as presidential, sorry, as their presidential candidate, despite the fact that no one voted for Hubert Humphrey, and he was not competing in any of the primaries, and so they just sort of drafted him in. And so at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, the Democrats prepared for massive protests because they had basically, well, not basically, they had ignored the wishes of all the Democrats that participated in the process up to this point. And so, while they are anointing Humphrey inside the convention, outside there's massive protests. There's a group called the Youth International Party, known as the Yippies, who nominate a pig called Pegasus for president. So that's pretty fantastic. A lot of these protesters were, of course, arrested. And side note, Pegasus also arrested. And the Democratic Party seems to be fracturing at the seams. And images of this unrest are broadcast across the country and, of course, paint the Democratic Party in an incredibly negative light. So, that brings us to the other two candidates that are of note here. On the one hand, you've got America's beloved son, Richard Nixon, is going to come back in 68 and run for president yet again. You know, the staunch Cold Warrior, vice presidential candidate, rags to riches story. Nixon's back, everybody. And from the South, George Wallace is going to run as a third party candidate opposing segregation. Oh, sorry, opposing integration, obviously, pro segregation. So you've got three candidates. All of them support the Vietnam War. Uh, this silent majority, as described by Nixon, were a group that was opposed to continuing agitation for civil rights, opposed to the unrest about the Vietnam War, indifferent about the Great Society, and it's sort of the idea of a return to normalcy. So Nixon was able to ride this silent majority of Americans to a plurality of the popular vote and a bare minimal win of the electoral vote. A couple things that are noteworthy, of course. Obviously, Wallace is going to take the segregationist South. The Democrats are still going to get the Northeast. But Nixon wins a vast swath across the middle of the country. And in 1968, finally completes what he failed to do in 1960 and becomes president of the United States. So now we have Richard Milhous Nixon.